Good evening. Welcome to our Bible study tonight. We are really excited. Yesterday, we made the announcement that we will return to in person worship on March 21st. That's our plan. If you'll remember, back in June and the first couple of Sundays of July, we had come back. We had a very intricate plan in place, and it worked beautifully for that time. If you'll remember, then the CDC declared Knox County a hot spot, and we decided to take a couple of weeks off and just watch the numbers, and the numbers went up month after month after month. Finally, the numbers are not only coming back down, but we have an increasing number of people who have been vaccinated, and we feel that it is safe now to come back with our plan in place. So we will, when folks come to church on that Sunday, they'll see us wearing masks. We will have the every other pew in the sanctuary taped off, and we'll do social distancing and no congregational singing for a while, no child care for a while, but we have a plan in place for all of those other things too. So we are just really excited to see this light at the end of the tunnel. And at the same time, still during our season of Lent, preparing our hearts and minds for our holiest day of Easter. Our Bible study tonight is from the Gospel of John. It falls in the second chapter in John, but is probably took place later in Jesus's ministry, probably right towards the end, and we'll talk about that tonight. But this is the passage in chapter 2, beginning with verse 13 in the book of John, where Jesus cleanses the temple. It reads this way. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and all the money changers were seated at their tables. He made a whip of cords, and he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned the tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "This temple's been under construction for 46 years, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed that the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. When he was in Jerusalem during the Passover festival, many believed in his name because they saw the signs that he was doing. Well, this is actually a pretty difficult passage on a lot of levels. Was Jesus justified in doing this, or could he have handled it differently, or did he sin by appearing to lose his temper? Those are things that I remember struggling with as a young Christian. But the author of Nurturing Faith, this is Tony Cartledge, he does a beautiful job with it, and he begins by asking this question. When you think of Jesus, what's the first image that comes to mind? Do you see him sitting with children or holding a lamb to his breast? You may imagine him standing by John in the Jordan, teaching on a mountainside, praying in the garden, or emerging from the tomb. These are the images that commonly appear on the cover of children's Bibles, in paintings behind baptistries, or in colorful stained glass windows. How often have we seen pictures of Jesus with fire in his eyes and a flail in his fist, upsetting tables and chasing these merchants out of the temple courts? Today's text paints a rarely seen portrait of Jesus. Gentle Christ had a temper, and he was not afraid to use it. So one of the things we'll be talking about was, why was he justified in reacting so harshly to what he found that day? Well, this story is in all four Gospels, but in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it occurs towards the end of Jesus' ministry, probably following Palm Sunday. So very well could have been just days before the crucifixion. But in contrast, John's Gospel places the event near the beginning of Jesus' active work, soon after he had called the disciples and did some miracles, and then this story, the story in John, as in the other Gospels, is followed by a question about Jesus' authority, but it is presented differently as the temple leaders ask what sign Jesus could cite to justify his actions. Some readers have accounted for the difference in chronology by proposing that Jesus roused the temple merchants on two different occasions, but the event probably occurred just once during the final week of Jesus' ministry, as described in the other three Gospels. Now, I'm going to tell you my personal opinion on this question of when this happened. I don't think this happened twice. I do think this happened at the end of Jesus' ministry, and here's why. When do people really react harshly? And in part, the answer to that question is when you mess with their money. And I believe that when Jesus did this, they were already plotting his demise, but this set the wheels in motion to happen even more quickly. When you threaten people's money, people react. And I think this really got the ball rolling, which eventually led to the crucifixion. Because when you mess with people's money, you can bet that they are going to respond somehow. He says the story begins by saying that Jesus went up to Jerusalem for the Passover. This was an annual springtime celebration commemorating Israel's deliverance from Egypt. So when Jesus entered the temple complex, according to the story, he found this marketplace, money changers, livestock, lots of business going on. Jews were required to pay a half-shekel temple tax each year, but doing so was not straightforward. The Romans forbade the Jews from minting their own coins, and the Jews refused to accept Roman coins for the temple because it had the image of the emperor on it, and they believed that to be a violation. Now, to get around that problem, this is what the money changers were doing. They would change currency into temple currency, and it just so happened they got a cut. So this was a business to them. So you can begin to see why Jesus would have been upset about it. He says, similarly, worshipers were expected to offer sacrifices during Passover, but the law made provision for people traveling long distance to bring money rather than driving their livestock there to make a sacrifice. So imagine the scene. Animals ranging from pigeons to lambs and goats might have been in stalls and tied up here and there, all these kinds of noise and smells and, just all kinds of things that would associated with animals. And that certainly would diminish any sort of worshipful atmosphere in the temple courts. Jesus reacted to this violation with anger, according to John, that he fashioned a whip out of cords and used it to chase both the traders and the animals out of the temple compound, while turning over the money changers' tables and scattering these coins all over the place. This was not a gentle Jesus, he says. He says the version of the story in Matthew, Mark, and Luke says that Jesus quoted Isaiah, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all my peoples." He also quotes Jeremiah. John does not cite those prophecies, but Jesus shouted, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." Now let me paint this picture a little more clearly, because I'll bet you remember when you were in third grade Sunday school, you saw a layout of what the temple looked like. And in the middle, you remember, was the Holy of Holies, and only the temple priest could go there. Right outside of that was where all the rest of the priests could go. Right outside of that was where all the men could go to worship. Outside of that was where the women could worship. And the very outside part was what was described as the court of Gentiles. And that's where this took place. Think about this from Jesus' perspective. The one place that anybody could go to worship was the court of the Gentiles. And they had made it into this marketplace. So you can imagine the anger that Jesus had for this. Our non-Christian friends want to not talk about the divinity of Jesus. We as Christians don't talk enough about the humanity of Jesus, that he did have feelings, that he was all human. And for someone who believed that God is love and had very harsh words for people who misrepresented God, then you can imagine what it must have been like inside for him to see this court of the Gentiles, where anyone could come worship, be changed into a marketplace. The author says expelling the merchants and their wares from the temple may also have foreshadowed the more serious work of Jesus' suffering and death, in which a heavy whip and worse would be used on him. Well, he ends he calls this last part a surprising prediction. He says, Jesus' furious charge left the temple officials equally fired up. "What sign can you show to prove us your authority to do all this?" they huffed. In other words, Who do you think you are? Signs are a central element in John's gospel, where miracles are often labeled as signs designed to indicate Jesus' power and authority, which culminated in his crucifixion and resurrection. And then Jesus told them who he was, although cryptically. Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days. And of course, they had no idea he was speaking about himself, and they scoffed at that notion. He says the narrative is intended to work on 2 levels. First, in the present, it was a confusing claim about the temple where the presence of God was thought to dwell. Only later would believers come to understand that Jesus was speaking of his body, in which the presence of God dwelt in human flesh. Jesus' body was subject to being killed, but he would rise again on the 3rd day. In the moment, Jesus' disciples were just as confused as everybody else. The author says it was only after the resurrection that they remembered what Jesus had said and made a connection between his death and the resurrection. The story may feel quite alien to us. Surely we have nothing in common with the merchants who had taken over the temple, or do we? You may have known churches that forbade fundraising sales as equivalent to money changers in the temple, but there are important things to consider. Have we ever seen church attendance primarily as an opportunity to gather with friends, to enhance our reputation, or to make business connections? There's always a cultural aspect to church, and that's something that we need to be aware of. He says, do we reserve worship as a sacred space and time for God alone, or think of it in terms of what we get out of it? If Jesus were to walk into our church today, would he need to clean house? Well, we all want to answer that question no, that our church would not fall under those kinds of categories. I can tell you that we have had certain conversations over the years that would reflect that kind of thing. Let me give you an example. There was a time in our church where we had a pastor who wasn't crazy about the children's sermon and having the children run down the aisles in the middle of the service. And you can make a point for that this is supposed to be a holy space. Now I have the complete opposite view of that. I love having the children in there. I love having them run down. I get to see your all's faces when they come down, and it's always such a joyful thing. But I can understand somebody else's perspective. There have been times, when our clergy decided to wear robes every single Sunday. I respect that. There's even been times where, the notion that you should not speak in church, that once you walk into the sanctuary, that's a holy place, and it should not be, a place to shake hands and do all that. I understand that perspective. I just disagree with it. I believe that it should be a happy place. I believe that children in particular should identify and remember what it means to be in church with really positive feelings, not being scolded to be quiet. But at the same time, we do recognize it as a holy place. But holy does not necessarily mean, being silent and all those things that go with it. I think this passage is important for a lot of things. One, I think it is telling us the story about what eventually led to the death of Jesus, and also how critically important Jesus took this idea of where anyone could worship. And I certainly hope we have that aspect in our church. Our doors are open to anyone who might come, and we want to be a welcoming kind of place. And at the same time, this is a preparation for us for our holiest day of Easter, where we want to think about our body as a temple and the things that we may need to get rid of in order to prepare for our holiest day. Well, I'm so glad to be able to spend this time with you tonight, and I'm so glad that we have the light at the end of the tunnel where we get to come back and worship together. And we will, I've been saying all this time, what are we going to do? We're going to try to do the next right thing, whatever that is, the next right thing. So I hope that means to us coming back permanently. But if for some reason something else comes up and the numbers turn or whatever, we're just going to do the next right thing. I'm so glad to be able to connect with you in this way, and God bless you as you go.